What if I told you that thousands of men once went to war, not for land, not for crowns, not even for religion, but for a bucket? Yes, a plain wooden bucket that would normally hold nothing more precious than water. Yet, in the year 1325, this object would ignite a conflict so absurd, so grotesque, that it cost more than 2,000 lives. Tonight, we dive into the War of the Bucket, a tale where pride, arrogance, and madness outweighed reason. And before we begin, hit that subscribe button because what you are about to hear will make you question how fragile human logic truly is. Imagine medieval Italy, not the grand Renaissance of Michelangelo and Da Vinci, but a chaotic patchwork of city-states, each glaring at its neighbors with suspicion and hatred. Bologna and Modena were two such rivals locked in centuries of bitterness. Their streets echoed with rival chants, their banners clashed in tournaments, and their disputes could flare into bloodshed at the smallest insult. It was a world where a minor slight could become a national disgrace. The bucket itself was nothing special. It was used at a public well in Bologna, weathered by years of rope and hands stained with the minerals of the earth. It might have fetched water for peasant soldiers and even merchants who had no idea their ordinary vessel would soon carry extraordinary weight in history. And yet, when soldiers from Modena stole this humble object, Bologna erupted in rage, as if the very soul of the city had been taken hostage. To the people of Bologna, the theft was not petty, it was a humiliation carved into wood. Honor was everything in the Middle Ages. To be mocked, to have your civic pride violated, was a wound deeper than any blade could cut. The cry went up in Bologna, "Return the bucket." But Modena's leaders, smirking with arrogance, replied, "Come and take it." That answer was like oil poured on a fire. Bologna was one of the largest and most powerful cities in northern Italy, proud of its university, its wealth, and its armies. To be ridiculed by a smaller neighbor was unthinkable. And so the people of Bologna decided to fight not with words, but with steel. Trumpets called men to arms, banners unfurled in the wind, and the blacksmiths worked late into the night sharpening blades. All because of a bucket. Modena, of course, was not about to back down. Though smaller, it was fierce cunning and backed by powerful allies. For years it had simmered with resentment under Bologna's shadow. Now, with the bucket hanging in their possession, they had a chance to strike a blow at their rival's pride. And so, Modena also summoned its knights and militias. The stage was set for war. What followed was no mere scuffle. This was not two gangs brawling in the streets. Entire armies began to move. Alliances were summoned like chess pieces across the board of northern Italy. The Guelphs sided with Bologna, the Ghibellines with Modena, reviving ancient rivalries that had already drenched the land in blood. A stolen bucket became the spark that dragged half of Italy into conflict. The absurdity is chilling. Thousands of men armored in steel with horses bred for war and weapons forged for conquest, now prepared to kill each other over a piece of wooden kitchenware. The clash was not symbolic, it was terrifyingly real. Farmers abandoned their fields, families prayed in fear, and priests blessed soldiers who would soon die for nothing more than civic pride. On the battlefield of Zappolino, the earth shook with the thunder of hooves. Knights lowered their lances, arrows darkened the sky, and the clash of steel rang across the valleys. Over 2,000 men would never see another sunrise. They died, screaming, bleeding into the dirt, while commanders shouted orders that made no sense in the face of the madness. And all the while, the bucket remained safe in Modena's hands. When the blood dried and silence fell over the fields, Modena had triumphed. Bologna's proud army was broken. Its men slaughtered its pride in ruins. The bucket remained in Modena, not returned, not hidden, but displayed with arrogant triumph. They hung it in their cathedral tower as if it were a holy relic. And there it still hangs today, an artifact of human folly, a trophy of madness. and a reminder that honor can kill as swiftly as any sword. The story could have ended there with a bucket hanging in Modena as a strange trophy of pride. But history rarely allows wounds to close so quickly. For years, after Zappolino songs were sung, bitter jokes were told, and the memory of the bucket festered like a scar. In taverns, Bolognese men clenched their fists at the mere mention of Modena, while children in Modena were raised to laugh at their neighbors' humiliation. Pilgrims traveling north whispered the tale with disbelief. How could Christian men blessed with reason slaughter each other over something so absurd? But in medieval Italy, where the papacy itself waged wars and pride was sharper than any blade, the logic seemed almost inevitable. Honor was a fragile glass, and once cracked men would kill to mend it. Imagine the widows who walked through Bologna's silent streets after the battle, their husbands and sons buried in shallow graves, their eyes still swollen from tears. They had not died defending Christendom. They had not died for land or treasure. They had died for a vessel that might once have carried water to their homes. The absurdity made the grief heavier, almost unbearable. In Modena, meanwhile, the bucket became more than wood and iron. It was a legend, a symbol of victory, proof that the smaller city had humbled its rival. Some say that during festivals, citizens would boast about it, pointing to the cathedral tower and proclaiming, "There hangs Bologna's shame." What began as mockery turned into civic identity. Over centuries, travelers came to see the relic. Not the bones of saints, not the chalices of kings, but a bucket. They stood beneath the tower, staring upward, some laughing, some shaking their heads, some quietly horrified that so many graves lay beneath this wooden trophy. And still the bucket endured, the wood darkened with age, but unbroken like a stubborn memory. Yet the War of the Bucket is not alone in history's theater of absurdity. Time and again, nations and empires have sent men to die over trifles. The bucket of 1325 was only the beginning of a long parade of madness. From pigs to birds, from ears in jars to oranges offered as love tokens. Human pride has proven far deadlier than steel itself. Consider the Pig War of 1859, set on the remote island of San Juan, caught between the grasp of America and Britain. The island was small, windswept home to potato fields and quiet farms. But peace was fragile, and it would take only one hungry animal to shatter it. Lyman Cutler was an American farmer, weary from days of tending his potato patch. Each morning he walked his land, inspecting the green leaves, pushing through the soil, smelling the earth that promised him food and survival. But each morning, too, he found a trespasser, a hulking black pig that trampled his crops and devoured his potatoes with greedy snorts. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, a British subject who seemed to care little for Cutler's suffering. "Keep your pig away from my farm," Cutler demanded more than once. But Griffin shrugged, dismissing the complaints with indifference. To him, it was only a pig, and potatoes could be replanted. But to Cutler, it was his livelihood, his pride, his survival at stake. On June 15, 1859, the confrontation reached its breaking point. Cutler emerged from his home to see the pig rooting again, tearing through the soil as though mocking him. Rage surged through his chest. He lifted his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired. The echo rolled across the island. The pig fell silent forever. Cutler might have thought the problem was over. Instead, he had just fired the first shot of an international crisis. Griffin demanded $100 for the pig, a sum that felt like mockery to Cutler, who offered 10 in a last-ditch gesture of neighborly peace. And when Griffin threatened arrest under British authority, Cutler ran not to a priest but to the American garrison, asking for protection as if the fate of nations were planted between his potato rows. The Americans answered with boots and bayonets. A detachment ferried to the island, with orders to stand firm. And across the water, the British replied with the thunder of anchors and the cold geometry of naval guns. 3 warships bristling with 167 guns facing 461 American soldiers, and 14 cannons steel glaring at steel over a single dead pig. On the bluffs, men cleaned muskets that they prayed never to fire, while on the decks below, sailors coiled ropes with hands that could have hauled history into a different channel. And all of them knew the truth that no one dared to say out loud. The first nervous trigger pull would write a chapter of war whose preface was bacon. Weeks turned into months of watchful silence. Binoculars raised at dawn, tents snapping in the wind. At dusk, officers trading stiff salutes that hid the uneasy laughter of men who understood the joke was on them. And yet no one blinked, because blinking meant losing, and losing meant being the side that surrendered reason first. In the end, good sense arrived like fog quiet everywhere at once. Diplomats whispered, commanders nodded, and the two sides stepped back without the symbols of victory or the drums of defeat, leaving behind only hoof prints in the mud. Empty cartridge boxes and a single casualty to list in the ledger of war-won pig. The border dispute would linger in rooms of maps and murmurs for years, settled after long arbitration that outlived the participants' tempers. Look closely, and you'll see the same anatomy as the bucket war. A trivial object becomes a sacred emblem. An insult hardens into identity, pride sharpens into policy. And suddenly, ordinary men are standing in extraordinary danger because no one wants to be the first to say, "This is ridiculous." Travel now to Western Australia, 1932, when the wheat ripened gold under a sun that gave nothing for free, and 20,000 emus 6 feet tall, legs like spring's eyes bright with unsentimental hunger, followed their migration routes straight through the fields as if the nation's breadbasket were simply a buffet laid out by the sky. Farmers begged for help, and the government sent Major G.P.W. Meredith with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds, a solution that looked invincible on paper and foolish in grass. The first volley cracked the morning open, and the birds scattered into lean, zigzagging groups that turned machine gun arcs into empty geometry. For 6 days, the campaign coughed gunfire and embarrassment, tallying fewer than 1,000 emus down, while most of the ammunition spent itself against horizon and dust. And in his report, the major admitted what few uniforms ever confess: the enemy enjoyed superior mobility, uncanny coordination, and something that looked disturbingly like guerrilla tactics. The army withdrew with its dignity in bandages, and its weapons conspicuously unloaded. Newspapers snickered across oceans, and the emus kept eating as if they had never noticed the declaration of war. Sometimes nature does not care about your medals, or your doctrine, or your budget. Sometimes the birds just win now. If you think that is absurd, wait until you meet a merchant captain who carried his severed ear in a jar long enough to start a war. His name was Robert Jenkins, a British merchant captain sailing Caribbean waters in 1731, when Spanish coast guards boarded his ship suspicious of smuggling, and in a fit of cruelty their commander tied him to the mast, drew a cutlass, and sliced off his left ear before handing it back like a grotesque keepsake, saying, "Show this to your king and tell him I would do the same to him." Most men would have discarded such a reminder of pain, burying it, or trying to forget the humiliation. But Jenkins preserved it in a jar floating in spirits, carrying it like a silent witness of rage, an artifact of insult waiting for the right stage. And for 7 long years he endured the stares, the whispers, the disgust, because revenge ages best when it ferments slowly. By 1738, Britain and Spain were already at each other's throats over trade suspicion boiling in Parliament, and then Jenkins appeared before the House of Commons, lifting the jar from his coat like a magician revealing a final card. The pale, shriveled ear swirling in the liquid, an exhibit more powerful than any speech. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Outrage cracked like lightning, and suddenly the focus of policy was no longer smuggling routes or economic treaties, but the image of a British subject mutilated by foreign hands. Politicians who had ignored abstract arguments now burned with fury at the sight of flesh and glass. war was declared almost at once, christened with the macabre name, the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict stretching across 3 continents in 9 years, swallowing thousands of lives in the Caribbean, the Americas, even the Philippines, all ignited by one man's stubborn refusal to let go of a jarred memory. The irony cuts deep. Had Jenkins thrown his ear into the sea, the water might have swallowed the insult forever, but by preserving it he preserved the spark of war, and his private pain became public fire. Pride again proved deadlier than reason, and the Atlantic drank the blood of sailors who had never even heard of Robert Jenkins. History remembers the oddity of the name more than the causes or outcomes. But beneath the absurd label lies the same anatomy we have seen before. An object becomes a symbol. The symbol becomes an insult, and the insult becomes a war. In this case, a human body part replaced the wooden bucket. Yet the madness was identical, even stranger. The war, Jenkins began merged into the larger war of Austrian succession, as if Europe could not allow a conflict to stay small, and his ear was eventually forgotten in the avalanche of greater causes. But the fact remains a jar carried through 7 years of silence commanded more soldiers than many generals. By now, you might be asking yourself, how many times can humanity repeat this dance of absurdity, spilling blood for objects that would fit in your hand? The answer, unfortunately, is more than once more, because the 19th century would bring us yet another farce, an invasion wrapped in romance and fruit. It happened in 1801 when Napoleon's shadow loomed over Europe, and his ally Spain marched against Portugal not for oranges, but to enforce the continental blockade against Britain. Yet, amid the destruction, Spanish commander Manuel de Godoy plucked the brightest oranges from the groves and sent them as love tokens to Queen Maria Luisa, turning conquest into courtship and horror into a grotesque bouquet of citrus. Picture the scene. Portuguese villagers fleeing their homes as soldiers trampled fields and looted barns. Smoke curling from rooftops while crates of oranges were carefully gathered, polished, and dispatched to Madrid. Not as provisions, but as romantic gifts from Godoy to his queen, a surreal mixture of ash and perfume, conquest and courtship. For 2 weeks, the Spanish advance was swift, Portugal too weak to resist, and every surrendered town added more fruit to Godoy's collection until the campaign became less about enforcing Napoleon's blockade and more about proving devotion with citrus, as if bloodshed were merely the wrapping paper for a grotesque Valentine. Historians later called it the War of the Oranges, a title that veils its cruelty in comedy, because behind the absurd name were families, uprooted soldiers dead, and an economy strangled. Yet posterity chose to remember the fruit, the bright, sweet, fragrant oranges that traveled farther than the cries of the displaced. Napoleon's blockade itself would crumble. Portugal would soon return to Britain's trade embrace, and all the devastation proved temporary except for the story of Godoy's oranges, which lingered in memory like a sour aftertaste, proof, once again, that personal vanity could rewrite maps and ruin lives. So here we stand, surveying centuries of madness. A bucket hanging in a cathedral tower. A pig gunned down in a potato patch. Emus outmaneuvering machine guns. A shriveled ear lifted in Parliament and oranges plucked as trophies of desire, each small, each absurd, yet each stained with the blood of those who marched behind them. What unites these tales is not the objects themselves, but the pride they provoked, the way symbols can swell into monsters when nations wrap them in banners and call them sacred. And suddenly reason becomes treason, laughter becomes insult, and men are ready to kill for wood, flesh, feathers, or fruit. The War of the Bucket might seem the most ridiculous of them all, but in truth, it is only the first verse in a grim ballad. Humanity keeps repeating a reminder that the line between honor and madness is as thin as rope over a well, and once snapped, it plunges us all into darkness. Walk through Modena today, and you can still find the bucket darkened by centuries' iron bands, rusted, but intact, hanging in its place of honor like a relic, and tourists stare upward in awe or laughter, unaware that beneath the laughter lies a graveyard of thousands. For the bucket is more than wood. It is a mirror reflecting every age that has chosen pride over peace, objects over lives, symbols over sense. The War of the Pig, the Emu Campaign, Jenkins' Ear, the Oranges, all of them live inside that mirror, waiting to remind us that we are never far from repeating the same absurdity. And so the question lingers for us, the living, what will be our bucket? What trivial insult, what foolish symbol, what minor slight will we one day inflate until it costs lives? Because history whispers one chilling certainty. Humanity is always just one stolen bucket away from total chaos. In Bologna, chronicles of the defeat were written with trembling hands, monks illuminating pages, not with triumph but with shame. Each line a record of folly that weighed heavier than any sin. The bucket became a curse in memory, a reminder that a city's pride could be shattered not by armies but by laughter. In Modena, the relic grew into legend, schoolchildren pointing to the cathedral tower as elders retold the tale with pride, their voices mixing boast and jest, never admitting that the ground beneath them still held the bones of men who had perished for that very trophy. Centuries later, during the rise of Romanticism, poets and travelers rediscovered the story, some treating it as comedy, others as tragedy, all recognizing in it the absurd theater of human nature, a theater that never truly closes its curtain. Think of the soldiers at Zappolino who tightened their armor straps, muttered prayers, and charged into chaos without ever glimpsing the bucket they fought for. To them, it was not wood but honor, not iron hoops but the invisible chains of loyalty, proof that symbolism can command men more than kings ever can. The pig. War soldiers likewise stared across San Juan Island, shivering in the cold mist, eyes locked on enemies who had done them no personal harm, yet their fingers twitched over triggers because a farmer's grievance had swollen into a matter of flags and thrones. They too were hostages of pride. The Australian farmers, by contrast, were not proud, but desperate. And when the emus danced out of range of bullets, they laughed bitterly, realizing that their government had sent them theater instead of aid, and that the birds had written their own parody of war feathers mocking the weight of uniforms. Jenkins, with his jarred ear, knew exactly what he was doing. He was wielding horror as evidence, letting decay become a weapon more persuasive than words. And in the gasps of Parliament he heard not sympathy, but opportunity, the transformation of his pain into a drumbeat for war. Godoy, plucking oranges while villages burned, was another actor in the same play, turning conquest into seduction, staining fruit with smoke, and proving that even love can be weaponized when vanity and ambition demand spectacle. If these stories sound absurd, they are, but they are also instructive. They reveal the machinery of human conflict. Insult becomes symbol, becomes pride becomes war. The objects change, the centuries pass, but the pattern endures like a melody. Every generation seems compelled to sing again. And perhaps that is why the bucket still hangs today, not only as a relic of Modena's victory, but as a warning carved in shadow and wood. When reason falters and pride reigns, men will march into graves for nothing more than the echo of their own wounded honor. Tourists who gaze at the bucket today often laugh, shaking their heads at the absurdity, but in their laughter hides unease. For deep down, they know it is not the bucket that was absurd. It is humanity's willingness to die for symbols, and that part of us has never vanished. The echo of Zappolino lives on in every border dispute that spirals out of control, in every quarrel where leaders refuse to step back, in every flag raised higher than human life. The wooden bucket is simply the most honest mirror, stripped of all excuses. Picture the battlefield again, knights sprawled in the mud, arrows jutting from the earth. Silence broken only by crows, And above this desolation, imagine a bucket swinging from a rope utterly ordinary, utterly indifferent to the blood spilled in its name. The same indifference marked the pig whose last act was to follow its hunger, not politics. The same indifference marked the emus who scattered not from fear of nations but from instinct. The same indifference marked the oranges hanging golden on their trees, unaware that they were destined to be messengers of war and romance alike. These objects were innocent. It was men who wove them into emblems of pride, men who sharpened insults into weapons, men who painted death with colors of honor. And the tragedy is not that wars were fought over buckets, pigs, or birds. The tragedy is that men could not admit the absurdity until it was too late. Historians tally the dead and list the treaties, but beneath the ink lies a simpler truth. The smallest things can reveal the deepest cracks in our nature, and when those cracks spread, no army is strong enough to hold the pieces together. That is why the War of the Bucket matters. Not because it altered borders or crowned heroes, but because it shows how fragile our sense of reason truly is, how thin the line is between laughter and mourning, between mockery and massacre. And perhaps it should frighten us that the bucket still hangs proudly, because its presence tempts us to believe that the madness is behind us, when in truth it waits quietly ready to return the moment pride outweighs compassion. For history is not a book we finish reading. It is a mirror we are forced to face. And when we stare at the bucket, at the pig, at the emus, at the jarred ear, at the oranges, we are not looking at curiosities. We are looking at ourselves, stripped bare of excuses. So the question remains lingering like a shadow at the end of every tale. What will be our bucket? What trivial slight, what foolish symbol will we allow to lead us into chaos? Because if history whispers anything at all, it is this chilling certainty. Humanity is always just one stolen bucket away from war.